The great thing about Justin's work is that he does not just intend it to be informative and educational, although it is both of those things. Justin really intends his work to be the beginning of a journey for each individual that sees it. A journey toward becoming informed, passionate, and engaged on these issues. So we thought it was a perfect way to start this session. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Are we on camera?
Yeah, baby.
Just make sure to show this at the wedding tomorrow. Filming a bachelor party ever amounting to anything good.
That's not a freedom. That's not a freedom.
Up here on the right. Hey, up here on the right.
Where do the high school girls hang out?
I can show it to Sarah later, right?
The single most lucrative commercial enterprise in the world.
The fastest growing crime on the planet.
Man, we're gonna get shot.
Boys,
Welcome to heaven.
sit.
It's a reality.
You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars.
This is not a lifestyle choice.
It'll be as long as you wanna make it, you know.
We live in a world where we don't necessarily know what's going on next door.
Yeah.
I don't even know where we are right now.
Oh yeah, some serious massage.
If you're not seeing it, you're not looking for it.
Dude, what kind of place is this?
It's everywhere.
It's not even light out. You're somewhere to be with no hesitation.
This is a terrible, horrible issue for our time because people don't think it exists. It's kind of a hidden horror.
6 ปีกว่าอยู่ประเทศนี้แล้วก็พี่คิดดูสิเรานี่ต้องนิพพานนี่นิพพานคนนี้ได้กี่คนอย่างเงี้ยหนูไม่เคยเรียนหนังสือแล้วก็หนูตามไม่ได้หรอกค่ะ
The first woman with whom I had a very intimate and sustained conversation was explaining to me that she was approached by a girlfriend who said that the girlfriend had a job for her in a garment factory. And what, in fact, her friend had done was sell her to a man for a week. And she was a virgin, so she had earned her friend what in their economy was a significant amount of cash. And the woman, she was late adolescent, was taken to a hotel room where she was kept for a week, and she was raped every day by this man who, when he was done with her, dropped her off at a brothel and said, "You now must earn me back the money that I spent on you."
There are a lot of girls who are stuck in brothels, but people have to get to work in 30 minutes. They have all kinds of other problems they face.
Trafficking of people is the fastest growing crime on the planet. And what we know is that it's the same groups of people who do all three, and they regard them as just commodities. The same people who traffic in weapons are connected to the people who traffic in drugs, and sometimes they do all three. There is slavery within the cotton industry, the chocolate industry, the coffee industry, within so many different industries.
There are more slaves in our world today than were extracted from Africa during 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade.
You could buy a young male agricultural worker on US soil for an equivalent of today's $40,000. You can buy that same young adult male on US soil today for about $300.
போய்க்கிறான் அது கடன் வாங்கி போய்க்கிறான் அது மாதிரி கடன் ஏறிக்கினே போகுது
அப்புறம் எப்படி கொடுப்பாங்க அவங்க
கொடுக்கிட்டேன்னு மண்ணாங்கட்டி அவ்வளோதான் அவன் கிரமதாச்சும் இருந்தானே போதும் நம்மளுக்கு கடன் பற்றி கவலை இல்லை நான் சொல்கிறது புரியுதா அவனுடைய ஒரு தெம்புக்காக தான் நம்ம வந்து செய்தால் தானே இங்கே வேலை 25 வருஷமாக செய்கிறோம்
அப்படி ஏதாவது இவ்வளோ கடன் வச்சுட்டு
என்ன பண்ணுச்சா வேற வழி
அவனுக்கு கொடுக்காம போயிட்டா
கொடுக்காத விட மாட்டோம் வரக்குறையோ நந்து ஒருத்தன் தான் ஏமாற்றி போய்க்கிறான்
We have a warning for you. If you have little ones in the room, you may want to ask them to leave.
There is an unbelievable injustice happening worldwide.
This is one of those rare issues where left and right truly agree.
So you have the two things going on simultaneously. You have economic boom, which of course everybody celebrates, but at the same time you have this dark underside of globalization, because we really have been enjoying the benefits of it. And I think as this issue emerges, it's not quite as guilt-free as you think.
A certain wistfulness about the past, the struggle for civil rights in the United States, or the struggle against slavery. Gosh, I wish I could have been around during the days of that kind of struggle. I wish I could have been a hero in some way, even in a small way, during the struggle for justice. All that wistfulness is totally needless, because those urgent battles are taking place in our world now.
You know, in 1787, 12 guys sat around a table and said, let's bring the entire British Empire slave trade to an end. Now, in 1787, that was like us sitting around a table today saying, let's bring the global automotive industry to an end. That was in a world where slavery was legal. Most people thought it was morally acceptable. Most people thought it was politically inevitable. And 20 years was all it took to bring it to an end.
The bad guys, the traffickers, the slave owners, they're committed to what they're doing. And they have a certain tolerance of do-gooders who come alongside and say they want to take them on, because they know at the end of the day, the commitment's not the same and they're going to prevail.
If we don't think it's wrong, then we're not going to be motivated to do anything about it.
Just focus on these kids who are being kidnapped and forced into prostitution.
And if common Americans care about slavery in our world today, believe me, your representatives here in Washington, D.C. will care. And if you don't care, or if you can't sustain attention for it, neither will they.
Each individual, I think, has the spiritual responsibility of cultivating that indignation, tapping into that rage, and then allowing that rage to be converted into compassionate action.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Randy Newcomb. I'm the president and CEO of Humanity United, and it's really thrilling to see such a terrific group this early on a Friday morning and willing to talk about such an interesting subject as this. It's probably not necessary to give much of an introduction after that film, and I want to thank Justin in particular for creating that just for this morning, actually. And we're going to hear more about Justin's work as well as the rest of our panelists. But let me give a few framing comments before we move into the panel. As you well know, modern-day slavery is one of the most fastest growing and most pressing human rights issues of our time. It's an issue that Humanity United has pulled out as a specific portfolio of funding activity within our broader philanthropic work globally. It's both profitable, as you saw in the movie. It's one of the most lucrative illicit international trades in the world today, second only to drugs trafficking. It comes in various forms, both from sex trafficking to forced labor, but it represents very common traits of violent or coercive methods to forcibly exploit adults and children into slavery. Each form of slavery is a severe and fundamental violation of an individual's basic human rights. Slavery affects our work as donors. It can be seen across many geographies and across a variety of programmatic initiatives. In terms of scope, we find slavery within human rights portfolios, certainly within portfolios of women and children, poverty reduction, civil rights, health, community development, and many other areas. The challenge to end slavery is phenomenal. It's a significant challenge that I think we can be up to as a group of donors. The theme of this year's Global Philanthropy Forum has been one of a turning point, of trying to identify those moments, those areas, those activities where a turning point seems to be emerging. I'd like to argue today that we see in human trafficking and modern-day slavery a turning point that is beginning to form in some really unique ways. There's growing public interest, there's increasing political will, and there's an opportunity for philanthropists to make this a central issue within a human rights portfolio. Today on our panel, we have what I would say are three of the world's really most outstanding experts in this field. To my right is Justin Dillon. Justin is the producer of Call and Response, a widely acclaimed documentary on human trafficking. Following the production of the film, Justin helped launch the Fair Trade Fund, an advocacy initiative targeted toward consumers. And he's also currently working with the U.S. State Department to create the Slavery Footprint Tool, an online and mobile application for customers. To Justin's right is Kay Buck. Kay is Executive Director of CAST, the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. CAST is one of the first U.S. organizations to work exclusively on the issue of human trafficking. Under Kay's leadership, CAST initiated a unique leadership development program for trafficking survivors to use their voice to advance state and federal policy. Kay will be talking to us more about that. And then to Kay's right, we're privileged to have Rani Hong. Rani is a co-founder of the Tronie Foundation, an organization that mentors survivors of slavery. She herself is a survivor of child trafficking. By sharing her story, Rani has helped the international community better understand the circumstances that allow slavery to persist. In her home state of Washington, Rani has testified to successfully pass legislation to address human trafficking. So if you wouldn't mind, if you join me in welcoming our panelists, and then I'll ask Justin to make his comments.
Well, it's a real honor to get to be here, and I want to thank Humanity United for including me in this. You know, when I woke up this morning, I was, it's just amazing that we get to do this, that we get to get together and talk about these things. What a privilege, and also what a responsibility. And activism is not a career path for me that I necessarily chose. I came from the music side of things, and when I first learned about this issue, I was actually playing music in Russia and had very little knowledge about the issue, probably about as much knowledge as most people did 5 years ago. But because I had a little bit of knowledge, I was able to spot something that I might have missed otherwise. And that, to me, is the definition of what trafficking is today. It's being able to identify something that you just might miss. And so, coming back from Russia, I decided to find any way that I could to get involved, and ended up making a film, which is a story unto itself. But what it did was it started a conversation inside of me. It was like, how do we create change in this space where it's everywhere, it's worse than ever, the numbers are atrocious, and yet we can't quite find ways and levers and handles to connect with it. What I knew in my heart was that anyone that I gave this information to, whether it's in film or in conversation, would want to get involved somehow. And there's that moment, and I know it because I've been a performer all my life, there's a moment when you have someone's attention that is the most precious, where you've moved someone to an emotional place where you have them, whether you're trying to give them a song or a film or trying to convey information. And creating those levers, creating those opportunities when you've got someone's attention and then giving them a way that they can be tactily involved. That, to me, that part of the social psychology of this movement is what interests me the most. And so once the film came out, we decided to engage in how we can not only aware people of the issue and maybe possibly inspire them, but the next trick for us is how to move people from inspiration, right, I have you, to activation. And really what I think we're talking about turning points here is we're seeing an opportunity for some real critical mass opportunities around this issue. You're right, we're starting to see the media come around this. We're starting to see government loosen up. But really, what we want to be able to do is how do we engage the public to own this for themselves? How can we create high impact, low cost, turning point mechanisms for people to own this opportunity for themselves? Because we feel like once that happens, we can really start to be able to provide the support that great groups like Humanity United are doing, or even the State Department are doing in trying to push legislation and policy forward. So the next thing that we're doing after the film is creating this thing called Slavery Footprint, working with the State Department on it, but really being able to provide individuals the opportunity to create their own diagnostic tool for how their own consumption interacts with the forced labor issue at large. Not necessarily the coolest thing in the world, but it's our job to make it cool. It's our job to make it something that becomes interesting to them, because it's not a real great sell to say, hey, I want you to use this tool, I want you to spend 5 minutes about how much you're exploiting people in the world. I'd love to get your attention on that. We believe that people do want to know, but we have to bring them along that journey. And for us, we believe the thing that makes people remember these issues the most is their story and the story of others in the world. And so the message that we're trying to put out is, how big is your plantation staff? We all have a plantation staff in the world, we just don't know who they are. And we want to introduce people to their plantation staff and have them engage in starting to set them free. So that's what we're doing next.
Thank you, Justin. We'll have a few minutes at the end to ask various comments and make questions, so appreciate that. Okay?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. It's so fantastic to see a full room at 7:30 in the morning on a Friday. And I say this because CAST, the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, is not only a policy organization, but we are in the trenches providing comprehensive services to survivors. And a lot of times when we're doing that, the room is pretty lonely, and we wonder who our supporters are and how we can get more people involved. And this room really represents that, not only in philanthropy, but activism and getting musicians and celebrities involved. So thank you to Humanity United for putting this together, and thank all of you for coming. So CAST, many of you, if you've lived in California since the 90s, you may have heard of the infamous El Monte sweatshop case that broke in 1995. And it was a case where 72 Thai garment workers, mostly women, but also a handful of men, were enslaved for 7 years in this makeshift factory in a suburb of Los Angeles. And you couldn't actually tell that it was a sweatshop from the outside. If you're walking along the sidewalk, you would have thought that it was an apartment complex. That's what it looked like from the outside. Inside, however, was a completely different story. It had razor wire all around the compound. There were armed guards and also dogs intimidating the victims inside. There was 5 traffickers in that case that withheld the identification of the victims, their passports, and all of the windows and windows and doors were boarded shut. And the only breath of fresh air that those survivors got was when, on a daily basis, they opened the garage door this much only, so they could put the bags of clothes under, and they would take it to sell in the garment industry of Los Angeles. And it was really one of the women who found a way to escape after 7 long years, and she escaped and found help outside and through one of the Thai temples. And it took a long time, but finally law enforcement started paying attention and went in and intervened. And that is how the 72 survivors were liberated. Now, in that case, it was before the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed in 2000, and that's a case that really started CAST and started our advocacy efforts at a federal level in order to protect the survivors, because our founders knew that if this was one case alone with 72 people, they knew there were more in this country. And they were right. Since then, we've handled more than 350 different cases, both sex slavery and forced labor, since that time. So I like to tell that story because it really shows us that this is still a relatively new issue, but there is a tipping point going on right now where you can see it covered in the media. More activists and celebrities and philanthropists are getting involved in supporting and raising awareness on the issue. But we still have a long way to go. I still speak around the country, and it's common for us to hear, what, it happens here? No, it happens in Thailand. It happens in Mexico. It can't be happening here in the United States. And it is. There are cases in every single country around the world. So it really tells you the global scope of this problem. Now, I also wanted to share with you a unique or one-of-a-kind community organizing model, because as we started to advocate for better laws that would protect victims, what we realized at CAST was that they had nowhere to go. And we celebrate freedom when people are free, but that's when the real work starts. That's when survivors in particular have a long journey ahead of them, as do the people who are supporting them. And what we did is we set up a service program that is based on intensive case management, legal services, and we opened the very first shelter for trafficked women and their children in the greater Los Angeles area. So now that's a larger housing program, but it's important because it gives people the support they need to heal from the trauma and, honestly, the unspeakable violence that they endured at the hands of their traffickers. And when they graduate from that services program, they are then able to move on to a leadership development program that's called the Survivor Caucus. And we did this because we realized that survivors' voices were missing. When I came to CAST back in 2003, and this was after a lot of international work on modern-day slavery in Asia, I realized that we were really good at applying what we learned in services and evaluating that, learning what is it that makes people heal, and then applying that to our policy initiatives. What I found out, however, was that we weren't engaging survivors in a way that was supportive and that was helpful to the advocacy process. And so the Survivor Caucus is exactly what that does. And I'll give you a brief example. Last year, we worked with Julia Ormond, who was featured in Justin's film, and some other activists, other coalitions, and asked Senator Darrell Steinberg in Sacramento to author a bill on transparency in supply chains. And the survivors in the caucus, who were survivors of sweatshops, they were actively engaged and spoke with legislators, they spoke at hearings, they helped mobilize our grassroots constituencies. And as a result, we now have that bill in place. And this was a time, I want to remind everyone, when the governor was vetoing a lot of bills last year. He vetoed all of the other bills that we worked on, but this one in particular, because we emphasized how important it was to have transparency in supply chains. And the fact that the caucus members, the survivors, were so actively involved in educating the policymakers and educating the public, it passed. Now, it's too soon to tell because it's not yet been implemented. That'll start in January 2012. But already we are convening the business community. They're engaged, of course, because they want to know how to comply with the new law. I'm wondering, what definitions our Attorney General is going to use. But what we're noticing is that there is this honestly refreshing and new dynamic where the business community wants to engage with the NGOs working on modern-day slavery. So I bring that up because I think we're at a tipping point, as Randy said, on this movement to do some really great stuff in preventing it. However, I think the real test is how we will engage survivors in the overall anti-slavery movement over the next decade. And that's one of the things that all of us around the table are working on how to collaborate and make sure survivors are supported in order to be able to help us end modern-day slavery. So I'm looking forward to all of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. Rani.
Good morning. It is great to be here and just to see all the faces, each individual face here, because you're here this morning because you care about this issue. And I really do appreciate, I stand in the shoes of survivors and their voices, and they could be here just saying thank you to each one of you, because you made an effort just to be present and to hear more. And so I appreciate that. I also appreciate Humanity United for taking the leadership and putting this together and putting the breakfast together and everyone involved, because when we step out and we work together, that's when we see effective change. right? And so I'm going to give you a 2-minute version of my story, and I'm just going to read a portion of it because some of it, it's not always easy to talk about, especially at a breakfast table, because we know it's a crime, right? I do want to give you a message of hope this morning, because I think we need to focus on the message of hope. What can each one of us do? And so a quote that I like is, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the ways of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants, murderers, and for a time, they seem invincible. But in the end, they will always fall. Think of it always, Gandhi." You know, I'm from a small village in Kerala state in India. It's a southern region where I live with a family of 7, loving family. Everybody was close together. But when I was taken from my family when I was 7 years old. I was sold into slavery. My transporters took me to another state where I didn't know the language, where I could be trapped, and I could not have a voice. I was scared, was abandoned. My captors and my owners used intimidation for force, fraud, and coercion. All they cared about was the money sign and how they could control a 7-year-old innocent child. By the age of 8, I was near death. They said I was worth nothing. There's no work I can do anymore. I couldn't bring any more profit to them. I wasn't making their business successful. It's a business. No child should be forced to do things against their will. No child should be trapped in cages. Have no option of crying for help. Because of my condition, my physical and emotional conditions were so dire, my body and mind completely shut down. This is what this industry is doing. It is shutting down innocent children, women, men, all over the world. We saw the figures, 27 million slaves. I happen to be one face, one name, but thousands of innocent victims. And so because I was no longer used to my broker, he sold me for international adoption into the United States. My adopted mother had no idea she was getting a little orphan Rani from India. At 16, my adopted mother passed away, and I was on my own. 16 years old, living in the United States, no family. I was hiding from the foster care system. I didn't want to be a ward of the state. I had enough. We're talking about here how I would try to survive as a high school student. I became vulnerable again to the conditions that lead to trafficking. When other girls were talking about, proms and the happiness of mom and dad, I was just struggling, trying to find food, trying to pay anything, the electric bill. It was hard. But we know 14,500 victims are brought here, right here, into the United States. We know California, as well as Washington, where I'm from, is a hub. It's a hub because of our airports and our waterways. And we look at the victims coming in from Mexico into California. Well, the turning point for me, you ask, where's the turning point? The turning point for me was 1999, when I was reunited with my birth mother through many amazing events and circumstances. I found my family. And I remember asking the questions, what happened? What's adoption? They had no idea. And as I started to realize there's something wrong in this picture, so I went into intensive research. What is human trafficking? What is slavery? We know it's a modern day form of slavery. Through documentation, identification of my family, I went through everything I could to find out about this issue. And that is when I chose to becoming an advocate. I knew another mother could not be separated from their child by buying and selling children. It's exploitation. And so I knew I had to do something, and that was my turning point. I also want to say my husband, Tronie, is also a survivor of child trafficking. He was recruited to be a child soldier from Vietnam, and that is also a form. So you ask me today, what am I doing? I have the story, and we know the survivors have to come forward. but not only survivors, but donors, corporations, NGOs, and how do we all come together and work on this collective voice, right? Because that's when effective change. One of my vision today, working at the United Nations level, working on international global campaigns, is we have grassroots organizations that are like CAST and others who are on the ground as we are working and we see and we hear stories. And sometimes at the higher positions, they don't always get to be on the field. So there's a huge disconnect between the grassroots organization and the global leadership. One of my goals is how do we bring it together? And we're at the same table. And then we talk and we discuss and we collaborate. Because again, that's when we're going to see a change in the system. As my organization, we do provide, I work with victims all over the world. I hear their stories, I hear their pain, cry with them. But I say, how can this voice be global? And that is why today we're all around to talk about this issue. You know, another quote I just wanted to say is, nobody's free until everybody's free. And that's Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a granddaughter of slaves and became a champion of the civil rights movement in America. So how, today, as we listen to more details of the story and the information, I have a vision. I have a vision that I stand in freedom. My life is free because of people like you who stood up. And so I want today, we came up with a 25 strategic plan with a group of many people in California, experts in the field. It's in your handout. But we got to go through vision, right? We got to see the positive, tell the positive stories so we're encouraged and we're inspired. So I call upon you to join us, to provide your resources, and become a voice for survivors and for all of us who are around this table.
Wow.